county, and then eventually the federal level. Education reform. A man by the name of John Dewey begins to talk about making education more practical, teaching students to learn by doing. So we get the whole vocational education trend in 20th century education. Emancipation of women has been around since the 1840s, since the 1848 Constitution celebrating the rights of women, the Declaration of the Rights of Women. But we're talking here about trying to make the laws more equitable, for example, in divorce, giving women a right to property, and of course, ultimately giving women the right to vote. A very important part of the progressive movement comes out of the Protestant religious tradition. And this is best exemplified by the Protestant theologian Walter Rauschenbusch. Walter Rauschenbusch wrote a very influential document called The Social Gospel. For those of you that have Mr. Peter in class, I'm very comfortable with this idea. The idea that true Christians practice the gospel values of justice and peace. And Walter Rauschenbusch talked about that in the late 19th century. Amid the poverty of the city and the immigrants and tenement housing, Rauschenbusch said the Christian has the duty to reach out to those less fortunate, to live out the gospel. Church was just not for Sunday. It was for living as Jesus would want us to do. It was primarily a Protestant movement. The Catholics pick it up, and into the 20th century you have people like Dorothy Day who build upon the foundations of the social gospel movement. One of the people that really got into the social gospel movement was Jane Addams. Jane was the daughter of a fairly well-to-do family. She was one of these middle-class women whose father had encouraged her to get an education. And then once she had it, she was kind of restless. What am I going to do now that I see these problems in society? She went to England and she studied the settlement house movement in England. Settlement house movement was about teaching immigrants in crowded cities how to live a more modern life. They taught them how to take care of their children, how to speak English, how to even how to bathe, how to take care of some basic human necessities. Jane Addams opened the first settlement house in Chicago. It was called Hull House. And I read just recently that it closed after almost over a century of working with the poor and the disadvantaged. And finally, there is a movement to reform government, to make government less corrupt, to make it less dependent upon the whim of a political machine. One of the organizations that takes this task on is the National Municipal League. Teddy Roosevelt, who spoke to the National Municipal League when he was chief of police, talked about the importance of bringing science and business to the world of government. It's not just about who you know and what they can do for you. A very important part of the progressive movement were the journalists who called themselves the muckrakers. The muckrakers are journalists. As I mentioned before, they are investigative journalists who took on topics in the 20th century that included corruption, the trust, and here are some of the names of these folks. Ida Tarbell, who writes a history of Standard Oil. Upton Sinclair, you may have heard about. He wrote the famous book, The Jungle, talking about the meat packing industry in Chicago at the turn of the century. His book is really responsible for the passage of the Meat Inspection Act, which we all hear a lot about, nastiness in the meat packing industry even today. But it was terribly bad back at the turn of the century. And Upton Sinclair exposed that. And his was a novel. He set a Lithuanian family in the middle of a meat packing plant and really wrote with such flair that it became a scandal to Americans who read the book. And then Lincoln Steffens, who investigated political corruption and the whole idea of the political machine in his book, Shame of the City. All right, the progressives managed to pass a number of pieces of legislation that are still very much with us today. You can see these 4 amendments. You need to know these amendments, know what they're about. The 16th Amendment established a federal income tax. The Constitution had made it illegal to tax the American public on a per-person basis. The 16th Amendment allows a change in the Constitution, and we get the establishment of the income tax, which we're getting close to. Income tax deadline of April 15th, so this is who we have to thank, the progressive movement. The 17th Amendment is a very important one. This allows for direct election of U.S. senators by the people of the state. In the past, senators were chosen by the state legislature. In each state, the state legislator, in our case it would be in Jefferson City, those folks that meet in Jefferson City would have chosen our senators. Our senators are Roy Blunt and Claire McCaskill. You may know that Claire McCaskill is up for re-election this year. Because of the 17th Amendment, we're going to get to vote on her re-election. She's not going to be chosen by the folks down in the state capitol. The 18th Amendment I alluded to earlier is the Prohibition Amendment. This makes it illegal to produce for sale or to consume outside of your home alcoholic beverages. Of course, this leads to a big uptick in the 1920s in organized crime that see an opportunity for making big bucks on the manufacture of illegal bootleg whiskey. The 19th Amendment is kind of the end of the progressive movement. It comes about right after World War I, and of course this is the women's suffrage vote. This gives women in the United States the right to vote in federal elections. The rest of these acts are passed in the decade of the 19-teens and into the early 1920s. These are all acts that regulate trade, trying to get a handle on big corporations and how they are doing business in the United States in the early 20th century. A number of other reforms are passed during the progressive movement. These first ones are important, the initiative, the referendum, and the recall. The initiative gives American people the ability to petition their state legislature to get a bill on the ballot that all of the people of the state can vote on in the next general election. Right now, Missouri is we are trying to get a bill on the Missouri ballot for August or November, which would allow a tax credit for parents who choose to send their students to parochial school. Your parents may be asked after Mass to sign a petition. Well, that's because of this idea of the initiative. This is where the people, not the legislature, the people, come up with an idea about a law, and they get it on the books. They have to collect signatures. They get enough signatures, it gets on the ballot, and then it goes to a statewide vote. The referendum is similar to the initiative. The referendum is where you take a law that is already on the books and you present it to the people for them to vote on, up or down. This is used by reformers who want to give government really back to the people. Let the people vote on a particular piece of legislation. The recall is also involving government. This is with the election of state officials. If you feel a state official has done something wrong and the state legislature doesn't want to act, the people can vote on whether they should recall that person from office. It's been used mostly in states to recall judges, and in some cases municipalities to recall mayors who have been elected and then turn out to not be good mayors. 3 names to kind of remember in terms of the progressive movement. These are all governors of reform governors. who began to enact progressive legislation in their states really before it became a national issue. We think of these three: Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, who went by the nickname Fighting Bob, Charles Hughes of New York, and Hiram Johnson of California. A couple of other major reforms from the progressive movement include this idea that city government should be run by not one political boss or one person, mayor, who owes his appointment to a political machine, but by a commission, a number of people who are chosen because of their expertise. In Galveston, Texas becomes one of the first cities in the United States to adopt this kind of form of government. Another major form of progressive reform in the area of government is the idea of the city manager. You hire someone who's an expert in how to run a municipality, and they become the manager of a city. And it's not as dependent upon the spoil system, upon political favoritism. Finally, and this is something that you would think we had already adopted, but the Australian ballot gives us an opportunity to vote in secret. We adopt this ballot from Australia, and it simply means you're voting in secret. No one is watching you vote. The ballots aren't color-coded. You don't have to drop them into special boxes that are labeled. You vote in secret, as we do today, the secrecy of the ballot. This comes really from Australia. Okay, in a nutshell, I've really summarized a lot of the material that you will see in Brinkley. Please take some time to review, to read Brinkley, to look at the study questions that are on the wiki, and we'll carry on with this discussion tomorrow.